The first track came up at 3:47 local time, climbing fast out of the central Iranian plateau. Within 90 seconds, four more bloomed behind it. By the time the picture stabilized inside the Combat Information Center of the destroyer USS Thomas Hudner, the count was 18 separate ballistic signatures, all arcing east-southeast toward the northern Arabian Sea, and the 3 American supercarriers steaming in a loose triangle just north of the Gulf of Oman. The ship's air defense officer did not blink at the number. He blinked at the spacing. The launches were not bunched. They were timed. 3 salvos, 6 missiles each, separated by intervals tight enough to overlap their terminal phases but loose enough to defeat a single interceptor volley. Whoever had pushed the button understood the engagement envelope of a standard missile, 6 to the exact second. This was not a warning shot. This was a kill chain in motion. On the bridge of the Gerald R. Ford, the strike group commander was already moving before the alert klaxon finished its second cycle. The Ford, the Eisenhower, and the Nimitz had been positioned in a deliberate triangle, each separated by roughly 60 nautical miles, close enough for mutual air defense, far enough that a single saturation strike could not bracket all 3. That geometry had been chosen weeks earlier in a Pentagon planning cell. Tonight it was about to be tested by live warheads. The first salvo apexed at 142 kilometers altitude. Hypersonic glide vehicles, by the look of the heat plume and the lateral maneuver during boost separation. Iran's Fata class, or something closer to it than open sources had ever admitted. Flyout time to the carriers, roughly 11 minutes for the lead wave, with the trailing salvos staggered to arrive inside a 90-second terminal window. 11 minutes. That was the entire battle. In the Ford's Tactical Flag Command Center, the picture was already resolving. The E-2D Hawkeye orbiting at 30,000 feet had handed off track quality data to the cruiser USS Normandy, which was now feeding mid-course updates to a flight of SM-6 Block IB interceptors warming on their rails. The cooperative engagement capability link between the Hawkeye, the Normandy, and the 2 escorting destroyers meant every shooter in the formation saw the same picture, refreshed faster than any single radar could manage alone. The weapons officer aboard Normandy called the assignment. First salvo, split between Normandy and Hudner. Second salvo, Eisenhower's screen. Third salvo, held in reserve, because something about the third salvo did not match the first 2. He could not yet say what. At 3:51, the SM-6S left the rails. 6 interceptors against 6 inbounds, with a shoot-look-shoot reserve queued behind them. The interceptors climbed on a high-loft profile, burning toward an exo-atmospheric intercept point calculated by the Aegis Baseline 10 software running on hardware that had been quietly upgraded across the fleet in the past 18 months. The flyout would take roughly 4 minutes. The inbounds would reach the engagement basket in 7. That left 3 minutes of margin. In a missile duel, 3 minutes is not margin. It is the difference between a clean kill and a leaker hitting a flight deck. The first intercept happened at 3 hours 55 minutes and 12 seconds. A clean exo-atmospheric kill, captured by infrared sensors aboard the Hawkeye as a sharp white bloom against the upper stratosphere. The second came 11 seconds later. The third, fourth, and fifth followed in quick succession. The sixth inbound, the trailing missile of the first salvo, executed a sudden cross-range maneuver during its terminal glide, a pull of nearly 9 gs at Mach 7, and slipped past its assigned interceptor by a margin too small to measure with confidence. The shoot-look-shoot reserve fired. A second SM-6 caught the leaker 14 seconds later, low and close, at an altitude where the debris cone would show. The sea surface roughly 40 kilometers short of the Ford. Close enough that the Ford's air boss ordered the deck cleared and flight operations suspended. First salvo, defeated. In the Normandy CIC, the weapons officer allowed himself exactly 2 seconds of relief before turning back to the second salvo. It was already inside 7 minutes to impact. The second salvo behaved differently. The terminal maneuvering was sharper, the spacing tighter, and 2 of the 6 missiles were emitting something the Hawkeye's passive sensors had not seen in the first wave, a low-power radar return modulation suggesting onboard seekers were already active, hunting. These were not pure ballistic shots with pre-programmed coordinates. These had eyes. The Eisenhower's screen took the second salvo. 2 destroyers, 1 cruiser, 14 interceptors in the air across a 30-second engagement window. The cooperative network meant the forward sensors were guiding shots fired by the Eisenhower's escorts. Distributed shooting. The Iranians, wherever their fire control was operating, would be seeing one impossibly fast, impossibly wide American defensive picture, and they would have no way to know which sensor was guiding which missile. 5 of the 6 inbounds died in the upper atmosphere. The 6th, one of the seeker-equipped variants, broke lock on its primary interceptor, descended below the radar horizon of the Eisenhower's own Spy-6 array, and reacquired in terminal phase using its onboard seeker. The destroyer USS Mason engaged with an evolved Sea Sparrow and a close-in defense burst from its phalanx system within the same 4-second window. The missile broke up at approximately 1,200 meters from the Eisenhower's port quarter. Fragments struck the carrier's hull above the waterline. Damage control reported a small fire on the hangar deck within 60 seconds, contained within 4 minutes. No fatalities. No catastrophic system loss. But the Eisenhower had been touched. That fact was now part of the operational record, and it would be part of the news cycle within the hour. Second salvo, blunted, not defeated. And now the third salvo was inside 5 minutes. The weapons officer aboard Normandy stared at the third salvo's track data and finally understood what had been bothering him. The 6 missiles in the third wave were not aimed at the carriers. They were aimed at the escorts. Specifically, at the air defense cruisers and destroyers that had just expended a significant portion of their forward-loaded SM-6 inventory defeating the first 2 salvos. The Iranians had used the first 18 minutes of the engagement to map the American shooting pattern, identify which ships were carrying the interceptor load, and direct the third wave at the magazines that had just been drawn down. This was not a saturation strike. This was a kill chain designed to consume American defensive capacity and then strike the defenders themselves. The realization moved through the network in less than 15 seconds. The strike group commander made the call. The third salvo would be engaged not by the cruisers and destroyers it was targeting, but by the standing combat air patrol overhead, F/18 Super Hornets armed with AIM-174B air-to-air variants of the SM-6, a weapon whose existence had only been publicly acknowledged in the past 2 years and whose engagement envelope against ballistic targets had never been formally disclosed. For Super Hornets, already at altitude, broke from their patrol stations and accelerated into a forward intercept geometry. The AIM-174B's range was sufficient to engage the third salvo during its descending mid-course phase, well before terminal maneuver, and from an angle the Iranian missile seekers were not optimized to handle. The first AIM-174B left its pylon at 4 hours 2 minutes and 18 seconds. 3 more followed within 40 seconds. The Super Hornets pitched up and burned eastward, relying on mid-course guidance from the same Hawkeye that had been managing the engagement from the start. The third salvo died in the upper atmosphere over the Gulf of Oman, far enough from the surface task force that the debris would never reach the sea. For interceptors, 4 kills, 2 missiles destroyed by overlapping warhead fragmentation from adjacent intercepts. For the first time since the engagement began, the air defense officer aboard the Normandy unclenched his jaw. Then the kill chain race entered its second half. Because in a missile duel, defeating the inbound strike is only the first move. The second move is exploiting the window that opens the moment the attacker's salvo is spent. The Iranian launchers that had fired those 18 missiles were now exposed, their positions revealed by the boost phase infrared signatures captured by American space-based sensors and cross-cued with terrestrial passive arrays operating from Diego Garcia and the United Arab Emirates. The launchers had roughly 12 to 15 minutes to displace before American counterstrike weapons could reach them. Some would make it. Some would not. That calculus was already running. Aboard the Ford, the strike package was already turning on the deck. For F-35CS, each carrying two Joint Standoff Weapon extended range variants, were spotted and fueled before the first salvo had been intercepted. The Ford's air boss had committed to the counterstrike geometry at the moment of first detection, not after the defense succeeded. That was the doctrine. You do not wait to confirm survival before launching retaliation. You launch retaliation as part of survival. Catapult 1 fired at 4 hours 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The first F-35C left the deck and climbed into the night, followed by 3 more at 20-second intervals. Their target package had been preloaded weeks earlier, every known and suspected ballistic launch site in the western Iranian highlands, prioritized by recent activity, mobility class, and concealment quality. The package H had been updated in the last 6 minutes with the boost phase coordinates of the launchers that had just fired. Flyout time to the nearest targets, roughly 40 minutes for the F-35CS, with the JSOWRs themselves covering the final 560 kilometers under their own power. Inside that window, the Iranians would attempt 3 things: displace their surviving launchers, reload from concealed magazines, and prepare a follow-on salvo against the now-known American positions. The race had inverted. The defenders were now the attackers. The attackers were now the defended. And the next 40 minutes would decide which side ended this exchange with its strike capacity intact. In the Ford's flag spaces, the strike group commander studied the displayed picture and made the second decisive call of the night. He ordered the Nimitz strike group, the third carrier in the triangle, the one that had not yet engaged, to launch its own package. Not against the launchers. Against the Iranian command and control nodes that had managed the salvo timing. This was the call that would matter most. Killing launchers degrades capacity. Killing the fire control architecture degrades the ability to use whatever capacity remains. The Nimitz package, 8F divided by a -18S carrying a mix of standoff land attack missiles and high-speed anti-radiation weapons, launched within 4 minutes of the order. By 4:11, the American task force had defeated 3 salvos, absorbed 1 minor hit, and put 12 strike aircraft and over 40 standoff weapons into the air. The Iranian launchers had perhaps 8 to 10 minutes left to displace. Then the Iranian counterstrike window opened. A second wave of ballistic launches lit up the boost phase sensors at 4:13. 12 missiles this time, from launch points further north than the first wave, sites that had been quiet during the opening salvo and were therefore not on the initial counterstrike target list. The Iranians had held back their second-tier launch. Hers specifically to fire into the gap they had created by drawing American attention south. The American air defense inventory was now meaningfully degraded. The forward escorts had expended roughly 40% of their SM-6 magazines. The AIM-174BS carried by the Standing Combat Air Patrol had been depleted to a quarter of their original load. Reload from below-deck magazines was possible but slow, measured in tens of minutes, not single minutes. And the second wave was inside 9 minutes. The weapons officer aboard the Normandy ran the math in the time it took the system to refresh the track picture twice. 12 inbounds. Approximately 30 viable interceptors remaining in the forward magazines, plus whatever the AIM-174B reload from the carriers could deliver in the next 7 minutes. Cost exchange, roughly 2-to-1 in interceptors per inbound, given the maneuvering profiles already observed. Worst case, the formation would burn through nearly all of its remaining interceptor inventory to defeat this wave. If a third wave came after this one, there would be nothing left to fire. The strike group commander made his third decisive call. He ordered the formation to disperse. The 3 carriers, which had held a tight defensive triangle through the first engagement, were now to scatter on divergent vectors, the Ford east, the Eisenhower south, the Nimitz northwest, at maximum sustainable speed. The screen would split with them. The objective was no longer to defend the triangle. The objective was to make the next Iranian fire control solution harder to compute than the time available to compute it. In a missile duel, when you cannot outshoot the attacker, you outgeometry him. The dispersion order went out at 4:14. By 4:16, the three strike groups were on diverging courses, their separation growing at a combined closure rate of nearly 90 knots. The Iranian fire control architecture, already degraded by the inbound Nimitz strike package now 7 minutes from its targets, would have to retask its second-wave terminal seekers against three different positional solutions instead of one. The second wave entered terminal phase at 4:21. 8 of the 12 inbounds were defeated by SM-6 and AIM-174B intercepts spread across the dispersing screen. 3 were defeated by ESSM and Phalanx in close-in defense. 1 reached the inner defensive ring of the Nimitz, was engaged twice by Phalanx, and broke up at 800 meters from the carrier's bow. Spray and fragments reached the flight deck. 1 sailor was injured by debris. No critical systems were lost. Second wave, defeated, at the cost of approximately 70% of the formation's remaining interceptor inventory. At 4:23, the first JSOWERs from the Ford strike package began arriving at their targets. 3 Iranian transporter erector launchers were destroyed in their displacement movements, caught in the open on mountain roads they had used for years without consequence. 2 more were destroyed in concealed garrison positions whose coordinates had been logged months earlier and waited only for the moment of justified release. At 4:27, the Nimitz package reached the Iranian command and control nodes. 2 regional fire control centers, both buried but not deep enough, were struck by penetrating warheads guided to within 2 meters of their aim points. A third node, mobile and harder to locate, survived. But the architecture that had managed the salvo timing for the opening engagement was now degraded in ways that would take weeks to reconstitute. By 4:35, the engagement had effectively ended. No third wave came. The Iranian launchers that had survived the counterstrike were displacing into deep concealment. The American formation was dispersing eastward, its interceptor magazines nearly empty, its strike capacity largely expended, its 3 carriers intact. And the 4th carrier, the one that had not appeared in any open-source order of battle. The one whose presence in the theater had been concealed by a deliberate program of misdirection involving port visits, false transit reports, and a sustained pattern of replenishment movements designed to suggest she was still operating in the Western Pacific, was now turning into the wind 340 nautical miles southeast of the Strait of Hormuz. The USS Carl Vinson had been operating under emissions control discipline for 19 days. Her air wing had not flown a single sortie above the radar horizon of any known Iranian or third-party sensor since she had detached quietly from her published patrol box. Her escorts had been transmitting on shore-based relays designed to mimic her electronic signature operating elsewhere. 3 separate commercial maritime tracking services, fed by deliberately compromised AIS data, still placed her 2,000 miles from her actual position. She had been the strategic reserve. Not a backup. A second strike. At 4:41, her catapults began firing. 16 aircraft launched in under 12 minutes, a mix of F-35CS and F divided by a -18S, carrying standoff weapons configured for the second-tier Iranian launch sites that had fired the second wave. These were the launchers that the first 2 American strike packages had not been positioned to reach. The Vinson had been positioned, for 19 days, exactly for this contingency. Her strike package reached its targets at 5:23. 7 additional launchers were destroyed. 2 reload facilities were struck. The mobile command node that had survived the Nimitz strike was located by signals collection from a Vinson EA-18G Growler operating in passive mode for the first time in the engagement, and was destroyed by a follow-on weapon released from an F-35C 12 minutes later. By dawn, the Iranian ballistic strike capacity in the Western Highlands had been reduced by an estimated 60%. The American formation had survived the engagement with 3 carriers intact, 1 carrier still concealed. And combat capable, and a strategic message delivered in a language that did not require translation. The lesson of the engagement, debriefed in classified compartments across 3 commands in the following weeks, was not about interceptor counts or missile speeds or the performance of any single weapon. The lesson was about time. The Iranians had built a kill chain that could defeat the visible American defense. They had studied the published deployment patterns, calculated the interceptor magazines, mapped the engagement envelopes, and constructed a salvo sequence designed to consume American capacity faster than it could be regenerated. Their plan was technically sound. It would have worked against the formation they could see. It did not work against the formation they could not. The fourth carrier did not win the engagement by firing more missiles. She won it by existing in a position the Iranian fire control architecture had not accounted for, at a moment when the Iranian launchers had already revealed themselves, with a strike package configured for exactly the targets the first three carriers could not reach. Her contribution to the battle was not measured in interceptions or strikes alone. It was measured in the fact that the Iranian planners, in the hours after the engagement, had to confront a question they had no good answer to. What else had they failed to see? In missile warfare, the visible force is the force the enemy plans against. The invisible force is the force the enemy cannot plan against. The distance between those two forces, measured in emissions discipline, deceptive movement, and patient concealment, is the distance between a defended posture and a decisive one. The three carriers near Iran absorbed the strike. The fourth carrier ended it. And somewhere in a Tehran planning cell, in the cold hours after dawn, an officer who had spent 2 years building the kill chain that fired those 18 missiles sat with the afteracti on picture in front of him and understood, for the first time, that he had never been fighting the battle he thought he was fighting. The battle had begun the moment the Vincent went quiet. He had simply not been told.